Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. It seems the Tower Mansion theft will soon be wrapped up. The boys' clever strategy to foil the incompetent Chief Collig and Inspector Smuff's plan to question Jackley gave Mr. Hardy the chance he needed to hear Jackley's dying confession. The criminal's last whispered words directed Mr. Hardy to look in the old tower for the loot. Now the only thing the Hardy boys need to do is to go to the Tower Mansion and retrieve the goods. Simple. Or is it? Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. The Hardy Boys in The Tower Treasure. Chapter 16. A Confession.
"Riley," ordered the chief, "see that package on the counter of the fruit stand? Go and get it and pour a pail of water over it."
"Huh?" exclaimed Riley, gaping.
"Pour a pail of water over it."
Riley took off his helmet and scratched his head. He began to wonder if his chief's brain had been affected by the heat.
"Don't stand there staring at me," snapped Collig. "Hurry up and obey orders."
"This is the meanest job I ever got," observed Con Riley. But he ambled across the street, wondering why a crowd of people had collected. For word had quickly spread that a bomb had been found under Rocco's fruit stand, and when he reached the package, he inspected it wonderingly.
"Maybe she'll blow him all to bits," suggested Rocco fearfully. "He has insurance," consoled the chief. "We'll give him a good funeral," observed Smuff.
Con Riley hunted around the fruit stand until he found a pail, and then he went up the street until he located a tap. Finally, with the pail full of water, he went back to the fruit stand, dumped the water over the package, and stood awaiting further orders.
"Soak it again!" roared the
chief, who was taking no chances. Con Riley sighed, but did as he was told. For 5 minutes he was kept busy dumping innumerable pails of water over the package, and only then did Chief Collig and Detective Smuff venture forth. Then, with fear and trembling, Chief Collig handed the package to Smuff and bade him open it. Smuff's hands were shaking so that he could scarcely tear apart the coverings from the water-soaked parcel. The chief withdrew to a safe distance. Con Riley, who had just been told by a friend that he had been pouring water over a live bomb, was trying to achieve a sickly smile as the crowd congratulated him on his bravery. Detective Smuff opened the package. The coverings fell away. The cardboard box, dripping with water, tumbled apart. A bright object fell to the pavement with a clatter. Everybody jumped. But there was no cause for fear. The bright object was nothing more harmful than an old alarm clock. The Hardy Boys and their chums, mingling with the crowd, roared with laughter, and when the crowd saw how Chief Collig and his assistants had been duped, they joined in the merriment.
"An alarm clock!" roared someone. "They thought an alarm clock was a bomb. Pouring water over an alarm clock."
Chief Collig and Smuff returned to the police station with all the dignity they could muster under the circumstances. The crowd howled and whooped with laughter. The Hardy Boys went home smiling. The 7 o'clock train had left half an hour before. Their father was making the trip to the city without the interference of the chief and his assistant, Smuff. Fenton Hardy returned home late that night, and at the breakfast table next morning he was in high spirits. "Solved another mystery?" asked Mrs. Hardy gaily as she poured the coffee. She seldom asked questions about her husband's work, being of a gentle nature that instinctively shrank from any discussion of crime. It frequently distressed her that Mr. Hardy's occupation should be one that meant terms of imprisonment for those whom his cunning and cleverness had brought to justice. But her husband's attitude this morning was so unmistakably jubilant that she was glad for his sake, if he had scored another success.
"Practically solved, my dear, if you'd care to hear all about it."
"Oh, not me. You know I don't care to hear about these terrible things."
"Well, the boys shall hear of them then. They are interested. If they'll come into my den after breakfast, I'll tell them all about it."
"That means you succeeded," Frank said. "Eat your eggs and bacon, and don't be impatient." After breakfast, the boys went with their father into the den off the library, eagerly awaiting news of his mission of the previous evening. They had not told him how Chief Collig and Detective Smuff had missed the train, but they were shrewdly certain that their efforts in this respect had been of considerable assistance to Mr. Hardy.
"First of all," said the detective, "Jackley is dead."
"Did he confess?"
"You're not very sympathetic for the poor fellow. Yes, he confessed. Fortunately, Chief Collig and Detective Smuff didn't show up."
Fenton Hardy saw that Joe and Frank glanced at one another, and he smiled quietly.
"I have an idea that you two scamps know more about that than you would care to tell. However, they failed to show up, and I had a clear field ahead of me. I saw Jackley just before he died, and I questioned him about the tower robbery."
"He admitted it?"
"He admitted everything. He said he came to Bayport with the intention of robbing the ticket office. When he failed in that attempt, he decided to hang around for a few days, and then he hit upon Tower Mansion as his next effort. He entered the place and opened the safe. Then he took the jewels and the bonds."
"What did he do with the loot?"
"That's what I'm coming to. I had quite a time making Jackley confess to the tower affair, and it was not until he was on the point of death that he admitted it. Then he said, 'Yes, I took the stuff, but I couldn't get away with it. You can get it back easily. I hid it in the old tower.' That was all he said. He became unconscious then and died in a few minutes. Just why he couldn't get away with the loot and why he hid it in the tower, I don't know. He didn't have time to tell me, but he said it was hidden in the old tower."
"Why, we'll find it in no time," exclaimed Frank. "Tower Mansion has 2 towers, the old and the new. We'll search the old tower."
"The story seems likely enough," said Mr. Hardy. "Jackley would gain nothing by lying about it when he was on his deathbed. He probably became frightened after he committed the robbery, and hid in the old tower until he saw the coast was clear, and he was able to get away. Then, no doubt, he decided to hide the stuff there and take a chance on coming back for it some time after the affair had blown over."
"That was why he couldn't be traced through the jewels and the bonds," Joe said. "They were never disposed of at all. They've been lying in the old tower all this time."
"I tried to get him to tell me in just what part of the tower the loot was hidden," continued Fenton Hardy, "but he died before he could say any more. 'I hid it in the old tower.' He just managed to gasp that out before he became unconscious."
"It shouldn't be hard to find the stuff now that we have a general idea of where it is," Frank pointed out. "Probably he didn't hide it very carefully. The old tower has been unoccupied for a long time, and it's rarely entered. The stuff would be as safe there as if he had hidden it miles away." Joe got up from his chair. "I think we ought to get busy and go search the old tower right away. Oh, boy! If we can only hand old Applegate his jewels and bonds this morning and clear Mr. Robinson, let's start."
"I'll leave it to you boys to make the search," said Mr. Hardy with a smile. "I've no doubt the stuff will be easily recovered, and you can have the satisfaction of turning it over to Mr. Applegate. I guess you can get along without me in this case from now on."
"We wouldn't have gotten very far if it hadn't have been for you."
"And I wouldn't have got very far if it hadn't have been for you, so we're even," smiled Mr. Hardy. "Be on your way then, and good luck to you."
"We'll find it, never fear," promised Frank, putting on his cap. "I hope the Applegates don't throw us out when we ask to be allowed to look around in the old tower." "Just tell them you have a pretty good clue to where the bonds and jewels are hidden, and they'll let you search to your heart's content," Mr. Hardy advised. "Come on then, Joe. We'll have that $1,000 reward before the morning is over." Their father glanced at them shrewdly. "Don't count your chickens before they're hatched," he said. And then, as the boys hastened out of the den, he called after them, "Also, you might remember the old proverb, that there is many a slip between the cup and the lip." But the Hardy boys scarcely heard him. So eager were they to begin searching the old tower, and so confident were they that the mystery was about to be cleared up. Chapter 17. The Search of the Tower. When the Hardy boys reached Tower Mansion that morning, the door was answered by Herd Applegate himself. The tall, stooped gentleman peered at them through his thick lensed glasses. In one hand he held a sheet of stamps, for it was his custom to devote the mornings to his collection. "Yes," he said testily, for he was annoyed at being disturbed. "What do you boys want here at this hour of day?" "You remember us, don't you?" asked Frank politely. "We're Mr. Hardy's sons." "Fenton Hardy, the detective? Are you his boys?" "Yes, sir." "Well, what do you want?" "We'd like to take a look through the old tower, if you don't mind. We've got a new clue about the robbery you had here a while ago." "Want to look through the old tower? Of all the impudence! What do you want to look through the tower for? What has that got to do with the robbery?" "We have evidence that leads us to believe the jewels and bonds were hidden in the tower by the thief." "Oh, you have evidence, have you?" The old man peered at them very closely. "It's that rascal Robinson, I'll warrant. He hid the stuff there, and now he's put you up to going and finding it just to clear himself." The Hardy boys had not considered the affair in this light, and they gazed at Mr. Applegate in consternation. At last Joe found his tongue. "Mr. Robinson isn't mixed up in all this at all," he said. "The real thief was found. He said the stuff was hidden in the old tower. If you'll let us take a look around, we'll find it for you." "Who was the real thief, then?" "We can't tell you just now, sir. Wait till we find the stolen goods, and we'll tell you the whole story." Mr. Applegate took off his glasses and wiped them with his handkerchief. He glared at the boys suspiciously for a few moments. Then he called out, "Adelia?" A high, cracked voice from the dim regions of the hallway answered, "What do you want?" "Come here a minute." There was a rustle of skirts, and then Adelia Applegate, maiden sister of the owner of Tower Mansion, appeared. That she used to be a blonde was apparent, for her eyelashes and eyebrows were so pale they were almost white, but apparently she wanted to cling to the appearance of youth, for the hair on her head was pitch black, except for about an inch of silvery white roots that had grown out. She had thin features, and she was dressed in a gown of a fashion 15 years back, in which every color of the spectrum fought for supremacy. "What's the matter now?" she demanded. "Can't a body sit down to do a bit of sewing without you hollerin' at 'em?" "These boys want to look through the old tower." "What for? Up to some mischief, I'll be bound." "They think they can find the bonds and jewels." "Oh, they do they?" sniffed the woman. "And what would the bonds and jewels be doing in the old tower?" "We have evidence that they were hidden there after the robbery," replied Frank. Miss Applegate sniffed again, and viewed the boys with frank suspicion. "As if any thief would be fool enough to hide them right in the house he robbed." "These are Mr. Hardy's boys," explained Herd Applegate. "He's the big detective, you know." "All detectives," said Miss Applegate, "are nosy, always prying into other people's affairs." "We're just trying to help you," put in Joe politely. "Go ahead, then. Go ahead," said Miss Applegate with a sigh. "Come around at this hour of the morning, disturbing honest folks.
Go ahead and tear the old tower to pieces if you like, but I'll be bound you won't find anything. It's all foolishness. You won't find anything."
Consent having been given, Herd Applegate led the way through the gloomy halls and corridors of the mansion toward the old tower. He was inclined to share his sister's view that the boy's search would be in vain.
"Might as well save yourself the trouble," he declared. "You won't find anything in the old tower. If anything was hidden there, it's been taken away by this time."
"We'll make a try at it anyway, Mr. Applegate."
"Don't ask me to help you. I've got better things to do. Just got some stamps in this morning and you interrupted me when I was sorting them out. I've got to get back to my work."
The man led the way into a corridor that was heavy with dust. It had not been used for a long time, and it was bare and unfurnished. Leading off this corridor was a heavy door. It was unlocked, and when Mr. Applegate opened it, the boys saw that a flight of stairs lay beyond.
"There you are. Those stairs lead up into the tower. Search away. You won't find anything."
"I hope we do, Mr. Applegate," said Frank, "and I'm pretty sure we will."
"Yes, boys are always going to do wonders. Go ahead, live and learn. Waste your time."
And with this parting shot, Herd Applegate turned and hobbled back along the corridor, the sheet of stamps still in his gnarled hand. He was muttering to himself as he departed. The Hardy Boys looked at one another. "Not very encouraging, is he, Frank?" "Not a bit of it. But it'll be so much the better for us if we get the stuff back for him. He won't think we're wasting our time then. Let's get up into the tower. I'm anxious to start." The tower was about 5 stories in height, as compared with the rest of the mansion, which had but 3 stories. The lower floor was empty. The floors and walls were heavy with dust. Frank and Joe first examined the stairs carefully for footprints, but there were none to be seen. "That seems queer," remarked Frank. "If Jackley had been in here within the past month, you'd think his footprints would still show. By the appearance of this dust, there hasn't been anyone in the tower for at least a year. Perhaps the dust collects more quickly than we think. It may have covered his footprints over even within a couple of weeks." An inspection of the ground floor revealed the fact that there was no place where the loot could have been hidden, save under the stairs, and there was nothing in that place of concealment. Accordingly, the Hardy Boys ascended to the next floor, finding themselves in a room as drab and bare as the one they had just left. Here again the dust lay heavy, and the murky windows were thick with cobwebs. There was an atmosphere of age and decay about the entire place. It seemed to have been abandoned for years. "Nothing here," said Frank after a quick glance around. "On we go." They made their way up to the next floor, after again poking about under the stairs, but again without success. The next room was a duplicate of the first. It was bare and cheerless, deep in dust. There was not the slightest sign of a hiding place. Much less was there any indication that another human being had been in the tower for years. "Doesn't look very promising, Joe. Still, he may have gone right to the top of the tower." So the search continued, until at last the Hardy Boys had reached the top of the tower. Here they emerged into the open air, coming through a trap-door that led through the roof from the upper room. They were now standing on a platform, and far below them lay the city of Bayport. To the east was Barmet Bay, the waters sparkling in the sun. The platform was quite bare. The stone walls gave no opportunity of a hiding place. Their search had been in vain. "We were fooled, I guess," Frank admitted. "There hasn't been anyone in this tower for years. I knew it as soon as I saw there were no footprints." The boys gazed moodily down over the city, and then down over the grounds of Tower Mansion. The roofs of the mansion itself were far below, and directly across from them rose the heavy bulk of the new tower. "Do you think he might have meant the new tower?" Joe exclaimed suddenly. "Dad said he specified the old one." But he may have been mistaken. In the darkness and everything, perhaps he didn't know the difference. That's possible, too. It's certain he didn't hide anything in this tower at any rate. Although, why he should say the old tower. Let's ask Mr. Applegate if we can search the new tower, too. What a fine chance we have. He'll crow over us now in real earnest when we go back and tell him we didn't find anything. He'll say I told you so, and if we try to get into the new tower, he'll just laugh at us. Oh, it's worth trying anyway. We can tell him the whole story about Jackley. That ought to convince him. Disappointed, the Hardy Boys descended through the trap-door, and then made their way down through the tower until at last they were in the long, gloomy hallway again. Their clothes were covered with dust, and their hands and faces were grimy. Slowly they trudged back into the main part of the mansion again, and there they met Adelia Applegate, who popped out of a doorway as they were passing and cackled with delight.
So these are the fine boys who are going to find the stolen stuff for us, eh?
She exclaimed in her cracked voice.
So these are the boys who were so sure it was hidden in the old tower. Well, well, and they didn't find anything after all.
I'm afraid we didn't, Miss Applegate, Frank answered with a smile. But if you and Mr. Applegate will let us tell our story, I think we can convince you that we really thought the stuff was hidden there. Even yet, I believe it is hidden somewhere in the mansion, probably in the new tower.
In the new tower, she sniffed. Absurd. I suppose you'll want to go poking through there now.
If it wouldn't be too much trouble.
It would be too much trouble indeed, she shrilled. I shan't have any boys rummaging all through my house on a wild goose chase like this. You'd better leave right away and forget all this nonsense.
Her voice had attracted the attention of Herd Applegate, who came hobbling out of his study at that moment.
Now what's the matter? He demanded.
Then, seeing the boys, his face became creased in a triumphant smile.
Aha! So you didn't find anything after all.
He began to chuckle, immensely pleased with himself.
I told you so.
Chapter 18. The New Tower.
They have the audacity to want to go looking through the new tower now, said Miss Applegate in high indignation.
Herd Applegate's smile vanished.
You can't do anything of the sort, he snapped. Are you boys trying to make a fool out of me? I knew mighty well you wouldn't find anything in the old tower.
And we were pretty sure we would, answered Frank. Listen, Mr. Applegate, we'll be fair with you. We'll tell you exactly why we wanted to make this search.
Go ahead and tell me. Why didn't you tell me before?
Because we wanted to work this out ourselves as far as possible. But the information we had came from the man who stole the jewels and the bonds.
What? Has he been caught?
He was captured, but he'll never come to trial.
Did he escape again?
He escaped by death. The thief is dead.
Dead? What happened?
Asked Herd Applegate excitedly. His name was Red Jackley, and he was a notorious criminal. He was tracked down by our father, and when he tried to escape on a railroad handcar, he got into a smash-up, and he was fatally injured. But before he died, he admitted robbing Tower Mansion.
He admitted it? He confessed?
He confessed everything.
I don't believe it, sniffed Adelia Applegate. Nothing will ever convince me that it wasn't that rascal Robinson.
Jackley confessed the whole business, Frank persisted, and on his deathbed he said that he hadn't been able to get away with the loot, that he had hidden it.
Where?
In the old tower.
And it isn't there?
Joe and I have just searched the place high and low. The stuff isn't there, and from the fact that there are no footprints or marks of any kind in the dust, I don't think anyone has been in the place for a long time.
The old tower has been closed for years.
So we thought, Joe interjected, that he might have been mistaken, and that he really hid the stuff in the new tower instead. Herd Applegate rubbed his chin meditatively. His manner toward the boys had undergone a change, and it was evident that he was impressed by their story.
So this fellow confessed to the robbery, eh?
He admitted everything. He was a man who once worked around Bayport, and he knew this locality pretty well. He had been hanging around the city for some days before the robbery.
Well, said Applegate slowly, if he says he hid the stuff in the old tower and it isn't there, he must have meant the new tower, just as you say.
Will you let us search it?
I'll do more than that. I'll help you. I'm just as anxious to get the jewels and bonds back as anybody.
Oh, nonsense, declared Adelia Applegate. It's all a pack of falsehoods. I don't believe a word of it.
Now, Adelia, said her brother soothingly, these boys may be right after all. It won't hurt to take a look around at any rate.
And much you'll find, I'm sure. I declare, Herd Applegate, you're just as bad as those boys are.
Maybe, he answered, but I'm going to help them search the new tower anyway.
Don't ask me to brush the dust off your clothes when you come back, then, for that's all you'll get. Dust, nothing more. The jewels and bonds are no more in the new tower than they are back in the safe right now.
All right, Adelia, perhaps you're right, but it won't hurt to make a search anyway. Come on, boys.
With that, Herd Applegate led the way down the hall and opened the door leading to a corridor that extended toward the new tower. Frank and Joe, tingling with excitement, followed. Although the new tower had just been built a few years back, and although its rooms had been furnished, it had been seldom occupied, save on the rare occasions when the Applegates had visitors from the city. The new caretaker employed to replace Robinson was a lazy and slovenly fellow, who did not bother to extend his duties to the tower, knowing that the Applegates seldom went near that part of the mansion, and realizing that any laxity in his duties in that respect would scarcely be discovered. It came as a surprise to Herd Applegate, then, to find out that the new tower was dusty, that the windows had not been cleaned, and that there were cobwebs on the ceiling. In the first room they found nothing, although they rummaged about in all its corners, looked beneath the table, behind the chairs, looked everywhere, in fact. Not until they were quite satisfied that the loot had not been hidden there did they ascend the stairs to the next room. And there again their search was fruitless. Herd Applegate, being a quick-tempered man, fell back into his old mood. The boys' story had convinced him, and he had been even more certain than they that the stolen bonds and jewels would indeed be found in the new tower. But when 2 of the tower rooms had been thoroughly searched, without success, his disappointment increased.
"Don't believe there was anything in that yarn after all,"
he muttered, as they went up the stairs to the 3rd room. "I don't see why he should lie about it after he confessed," remarked Frank thoughtfully. "Dad told us that he admitted not being able to get away with the stuff."
"Then where did he hide it?" demanded Applegate. "If he wasn't lying, the stuff must be around here someplace."
"Perhaps he hid it a little more carefully than we imagine," put in Joe.
"Haven't we hunted carefully enough?"
Herd Applegate snapped. In the 3rd room, their search was again in vain. They even inspected the window ledges and tapped the floors and ceiling in the faint hope of finding some secret cupboard that was unknown to them. But the loot was not found. When at last they emerged through the trap door in the roof, out on the top of the rear tower, and found it to be bare and empty, Applegate could not disguise his chagrin.
"Wild goose chase," he snorted. "Adelia was right. I've been made a fool of."
"You don't think we would make up a story like that, do you, Mr. Applegate?" Frank asked.
"I don't see any reason why you should, but there's something wrong somewhere. I've wasted half a morning poking around through this confounded tower, all for nothing."
"So have we."
"If that fellow did hide the stuff in one of the towers, someone else must have come along and got it. That's the only way I can figure it out. He had someone working with him. Or else Robinson found the stuff? That's more likely. Probably Robinson found the loot right after the robbery and kept it for himself.
I don't think he would do that. He isn't that kind of a man, Joe objected.
With all that money in front of him, I wouldn't put it past him for a minute. Where did he get that $900 then? Explain that. He can't. He won't tell.
As they descended the stairs and went back into the main part of the mansion, Herd Applegate elaborated on this theory. The fact that the loot had not been found in the face of Red Jackley's story seemed to strengthen his conviction that Robinson had something to do with the affair.
Either Robinson found the stuff and kept it, or else he was in league with Jackley, said Applegate. He's mixed up in it some way, I'm sure of it.
The boys could say nothing. They realized that the theory was probable, although in their hearts they found it hard to believe that their chum's father could have had anything to do with the theft. They were deeply puzzled and tremendously disappointed, for they had been practically certain that the loot would be found. Now they saw that the only consequence of the whole affair was to involve Mr. Robinson more deeply than ever in the mystery. Back in the hallway, they endured the taunts of Adelia Applegate, who cackled jubilantly when she saw that the searching party had returned empty-handed.
There now, she crowed. Who's right now? Didn't I tell you it was all nonsense? Herd Applegate, you've simply been made a fool of by these two boys. Now, Adelia, I think they meant well. Meant well? Of course they meant well. And what did it gain you? They've prowled through the whole place all morning, and all the good that's come of it is that perhaps you won't be so ready to believe the next cock and bull story someone tells you. Go back to your stamps, Herd Applegate, and let it be a lesson to you. As for you boys, you should be ashamed of yourselves, disturbing folks like this.
Whereupon she escorted the Hardy boys to the door, while Herd Applegate, muttering sadly, went back to his study with a puzzled air. Chapter 19. The Mystery Deepens. Fenton Hardy was dumbfounded when his sons returned to him with the news that the loot had been found in neither the old tower nor the new. So implicitly had he believed in the dying confession of Red Jackley that he had not even bothered to join in the search, preferring to let his sons have the satisfaction of recovering the stolen goods that he was positive were hidden in the old tower. "And you searched the place thoroughly?" he asked for the third time. "Every inch of it. There was nothing in the old tower. No one had been there in weeks," answered Frank.
"How could you tell?"
"By the dust. It hadn't been disturbed. There wasn't a footprint of any kind."
"But you searched anyway?"
"We went through the tower from top to bottom," Frank replied. "It wasn't any use. No one had been there. So then we thought Jackley might have been mistaken, and that he had left the stuff in the other tower."
"And Applegate let you search that as well?"
And Fenton Hardy's eyes twinkled. "Not until we had told him our reasons. We told him about Jackley, and then he became enthusiastic and even helped us in the search. But we didn't find anything."
"Strange," muttered the detective. "I know Jackley wasn't lying. He had nothing to gain by deceiving me. Absolutely nothing. He was in real earnest if ever a man was. I hid it in the old tower. Those were his words. He would have told more if he'd been able. And what could he mean but the old tower of Tower Mansion? Why should he be so careful to say the old tower? Everyone knows the mansion has two towers, the old and the new." "Of course it may be that we didn't search thoroughly enough," Joe said. "The stuff may be hidden in the flooring or behind the walls." "That's the only solution I can think of," replied Fenton Hardy. "I'm not satisfied yet that the loot isn't there. I'm going to get in touch with Applegate and ask permission for a real, thorough search of both towers. It's to his interest as well as mine."
"Applegate thinks possibly Jackley hid the stuff all right, but that Robinson found it and sold it," said Frank. "He hinted that he was of the opinion that Robinson was in league with the thief." "It does look rather bad," Mr. Hardy admitted. "One couldn't blame Applegate very much for thinking Robinson found the stuff after it was hidden, and made away with it." "Robinson wouldn't do that," cried Joe. "He's too honest."
"I don't think he would do it either, but sometimes if a man is in need of money, and temptation is placed in his way, he gives in. I'd hate to believe that of Robinson, but if that stuff isn't found in the tower, I'll have to admit that it looks very much as if he were mixed up in it."
The interview with their father left the Hardy boys feeling far from cheerful, for they saw that Mr. Robinson was now more deeply involved in the affair than before. On the face of it, circumstances seemed to be against the caretaker. "Just the same," said Frank as the boys left the house and went down the street, "I don't believe Jackley ever hid the stuff in the tower. If he had even so much as opened the tower door, he would have left some marks in the dust, and we would have seen them. So I don't believe Robinson came along later and got the loot. As we saw, the dust in the tower hadn't been disturbed in weeks. Why, there was even dust on the doorknob when Mr. Applegate let us in." "Then why should Jackley say he hid the stuff in there?" exclaimed Frank, puzzled.
"Don't ask me. I'm just as much in the dark as you are."
When the boys reached the business section of the city, they found that already Jackley's confession had become common property. People were discussing the deathbed confession on the street corners, and newsboys were busy selling copies of papers in which the story of the criminal's last statement was featured on the front page under black headlines. Policeman Con Riley was ambling along Main Street in the morning sunshine, swinging his club with the air of a man without a care in the world. When he saw the boys, he frowned, for there was no love lost between the Hardys and the Bayport Police Department.
"Well," he grunted, "I hear you got the stuff back."
"I wish we had," said Frank.
"What?" said the constable,
brightening up at once.
"You didn't get it? I thought it said in the paper this morning that this fellow Jackley told where he'd hidden it."
"He did."
"And you can't find it? Ho, ho, ho!"
Con Riley indulged in a hearty laugh.
"What a fine detective your father is! Didn't Jackley say the stuff was hidden in the old tower? What more does he want?"
"Our father didn't search for the stuff," retorted Frank. "We did, and it wasn't there. Jackley must have made a mistake."
"It wasn't there!" exclaimed Riley in high delight. "Ha! That's a good one. That's the best I've heard in years."
He chuckled exceedingly and slapped his knee.
"Jackley put a good one over on your father that time. Ho, ho, ho! The stuff wasn't there."
Riley wiped the tears from his eyes and went on his way, trying to laugh and trying at the same time to retain his dignity as an officer of the law. The joke, he decided, was too good to keep, so as he proceeded back toward the police station, there to edify Chief Collig and Detective Smuff with the tale, he buttonholed various passers-by and poured the story into their willing ears. It was not long before the yarn had spread throughout the city with that swiftness peculiar to stories spread by word of mouth, and in the telling, the story was exaggerated, the net effect being that Fenton Hardy was made to look ridiculous by believing a false confession. Highly colored accounts of the boys' search of the old tower spread quickly, and throughout the day they were subjected to many caustic and sarcastic inquiries on the part of friends and acquaintances alike. They took all these remarks in good part, although they did not enjoy their sudden prominence. "Never mind," said Frank. "We'll show them yet." "I hope they find that stuff when they search the towers again," added Joe. "Then the people'll have to eat crow. It'll be our turn to laugh." "Yes," agreed Frank. "But just now our laughter seems to be in the far distant future." When they returned home, they found that Fenton Hardy had been busy in the meantime, and had convinced Herd Applegate that a thorough search of the towers would be advisable. True, he had not accomplished this without a great deal of opposition on the part of Adelia, and without misgivings on the part of Herd Applegate himself, who had by that time come to the conclusion that Robinson had indeed been mixed up in the affair all along. In this conviction, he was sustained by Chief Collig, who had paid a call at the Applegate home as soon as Riley had told him of the vain search of the towers.
"The chief says Robinson is behind it, and I'm beginning to think he's right," said Applegate.
"But how about the confession?" Mr. Hardy asked.
"The chief says that's all a blind. Jackley did it to protect Robinson. They were both working together."
"I know it looks bad for Robinson, but I don't think it would hurt to give the towers another thorough search. I was the one who heard Jackley make the confession, and I don't believe he was lying. I believe he was trying to tell me all he knew."
Maybe. I think he was too smart for you, Mr. Hardy. And everybody else thinks so too. It was all a hoax."
"I'll believe that after I've searched the towers inside and out."
"Well, go ahead. Go as far as you like. But I don't think you'll find that treasure."
With that, Mr. Hardy was content. He made preparations for a search of the towers, although Adelia Applegate flatly declared that the detective was making a laughingstock of her and her brother, and that if the nonsense continued, she would leave Tower Mansion forever, and carry out her oft-expressed intention of going to one of the South Sea Islands as a missionary. In spite of the protestations of the worthy lady, however, the search was carried out. The old tower was visited first, and for the greater part of the following morning, the place was searched from top to bottom. Even the floors were torn up in places, in the quest for some secret hiding place in which Jackley might have left the loot. But although Fenton Hardy, accompanied by the boys and Herd Applegate, who soon became infected with the dogged enthusiasm of the others, and lent every assistance in his power, hunted throughout the old tower in every conceivable place, the missing jewels and bonds were not recovered.
"Nothing left but to search the new tower,"
Mr. Hardy commented briefly, when the search was over. And throughout the whole afternoon the new tower was the scene of a search that was as thorough as it was fruitless. Walls and partitions were tapped, floors were sounded, furniture was minutely examined. Not an inch of space escaped the minute scrutiny of the detective and his helpers. But as the search wore on, and the loot still evaded discovery, the chagrin of Fenton Hardy deepened, and Herd Applegate finally lost his temper.
"A hoax!" he declared. "A hoax from start to finish."
"The man was in earnest," the detective insisted.
"Then where's the stuff?"
"Someone else may have found it. That's the only explanation I can think of."
"Who else could have taken it but Robinson?"
To this, Mr. Hardy was silent. In spite of his knowledge of and liking for the man, he was beginning to suspect that the caretaker may have had a hand in the affair after all.
"Either that or Jackley simply told that yarn to shield Robinson," declared Applegate.
"I'm not going to give up this search yet," said Mr. Hardy patiently. "Perhaps the loot was hidden somewhere about the grounds." So the grounds of Tower Mansion, particularly in the vicinity of the two towers, were thoroughly searched. The shrubbery was inspected, but to no avail. The search continued until sundown, and by that time Adelia Applegate was pale with wrath, for the place, as she expressed it, had been turned upside down. Herd Applegate was outspoken in his rage and disappointment, while Fenton Hardy was deeply chagrined. As for the boys, although they had expected that the additional search would be without success, they shared their father's bewilderment.
"I can't understand it," admitted the detective. "I could have sworn that Jackley was in earnest when he made that confession. He knew he was near death, and that he had nothing to gain by concealment. I can't understand it at all."
And there the mystery remained, deeper than it had ever been. Chapter 20. The Flash in the Tower. For 2 days after the unsuccessful search of Tower Mansion, there were no further developments in the affair of the robbery. But on the third day, Chief Collig took a hand. The first intimation the Hardy boys had of it was when they met Callie Shaw and Iola Morton, on their way to school. Iola, a plump, dark girl, was a sister of Chet Morton, and had achieved the honor of being about the only girl Joe Hardy had ever conceded to be anything but an unmitigated nuisance. Joe, who was shy in the presence of girls, professed a lofty scorn for all members of the other sex, particularly those of high school age, but had once grudgingly admitted that Iola Morton was all right for a girl. This, from him, was high praise. "Have you heard what's happened?" asked Callie, as they met the boys near the school entrance. "School called off for today?" asked Joe eagerly. No, nothing like that. It's about the Robinsons." "What's happened now?" "Mr. Robinson has been arrested again." The Hardy boys stared at her as though thunderstruck. "What for?" demanded Frank in astonishment. "Over that robbery at Tower Mansion. He's been working in the city lately, and Chief Collig sent Detective Smuff for him last night. Iola and I were over to see the Robinson girls last night, and they told us all about it. Smuff should be back by now." "Well, can you beat that?" exclaimed Frank. "I wonder what's the big idea of arresting him again." "It seems the chief has an idea that Mr. Robinson was in league with this man Jackley, the man your father got the confession from. He told Mrs. Robinson last night that he was sure Mr. Robinson had the stuff hidden somewhere, and that he was going to find out. He was perfectly mean and nasty about it, and Mrs. Robinson doesn't know what to do." The Hardy boys looked at one another. The affair had suddenly assumed more serious proportions. "If Mr. Robinson is brought back, he'll lose his job, and he had a hard time getting it anyway," said Iola. "The worst of it is," said Frank slowly, "that the case looks pretty bad against Mr. Robinson." "You don't think they'll send him to the penitentiary?" "It looks bad. The thief said he hid the stuff in the old tower. When we looked for it, the stuff wasn't there. About the only person that could have found it and taken it away was Mr. Robinson himself." "He wouldn't do it," declared Iola indignantly. "We're sure he wouldn't, but a jury mightn't be so easy to convince." It was time to go into school at that moment, and they went to their classrooms. Frank and Joe deeply worried by what they had just heard. At recess that morning, they met Jerry, Phil, Tony, and Chet Morton, and told them the news. All the boys were highly concerned over this sudden turn in events. "This'll be tough on Perry," said Phil. "It'll be tough on the whole family," Chet declared. "They've had enough trouble over this dirty affair as it is." The boys discussed the situation from all angles and racked their brains for some way whereby they could help the Robinsons, but they were reluctantly forced to admit that only by actual discovery of the hidden loot could Mr. Robinson be cleared of suspicion in connection with the robbery. Even if he were tried and acquitted, it would be a stain on his reputation for the rest of his life, as long as the treasure isn't recovered, Frank summed up. "We'll just have to wait and see what happens," Joe said. "We've done all we could, and it hasn't been enough." "And Dad has done the same. I'm sorry on his account. He was so sure he'd cleared up the whole thing when he got the confession from Jackley. But there was something lacking." "Well, we all helped too," remarked Jerry. "We kept Collig and Smuff from catching that train. Jackley wouldn't have talked at all if they'd have seen him." So, reluctantly enough, the boys were forced to admit that they were facing a stone wall. This was also the conclusion of Fenton Hardy when they talked to him at lunch that day. "There's nothing to be done," said the detective. "Robinson has been arrested, and while he might be cleared by a skillful lawyer, he hasn't any money to spend on his defense. Whether he's cleared or not, his reputation is ruined." "Unless the loot is found," put in Joe. "Yes, unless that loot is found. That's his only hope. But I don't think there's much chance of that." And there the mystery of Tower Mansion rested for the time being. The arrest of Mr. Robinson furnished a sensation for a day or so, and then the case receded into the background, the newspapers finding other things to become excited about. But for the Robinsons, it was, naturally enough, a matter of supreme moment. Perry Robinson paid a call at the Hardy home, pleading with the great detective to continue his efforts to clear the accused man. Mr. Hardy was sympathetic, but as he said, he was facing a stone wall. "I've done all I can, my boy," he explained to the grief-stricken lad. "If there was anything more I could do, I would do it. But there are no more clues. If Red Jackley's confession couldn't clear up the affair, then nothing else could. I'm afraid—" He left the sentence unfinished. "Do you mean my father'll go to jail?" "I wouldn't say that, but you must be prepared to face the worst." "He didn't do it," said Perry doggedly. "I know you have confidence in him, but the law only looks at the facts. Many an innocent man has been convicted on less evidence." "It'll kill my mother." Mr. Hardy was silent. "I don't know what to do," said Perry. "I'd do anything to save him, but there's nothing any of us can do now unless by some lucky chance the loot is recovered. That would clear everything up, of course, but in the meantime, we just have to wait and hope." "And you can't do anything more, Mr. Hardy?" "A detective is not a miracle man, my boy," said Fenton Hardy kindly. "He is only a man who is trained in tracing criminals. He has to go by the facts at his disposal. I have exhausted every line of action in this case. Everything that could be done has been done." Perry Robinson got up, twisting his cap nervously in his hands. "We all thank you very much too, Mr. Hardy," he said huskily. "Don't think I've been ungrateful by coming here and asking you to do more. I guess I didn't realize just how hopeless it is." "It isn't hopeless, exactly. Don't think that. There's always hope, you know. But be prepared for the worst." "I'll have to be." With that, the boy left. Frank and Joe met him in the hallway and awkwardly tried to express their sympathy. Perry was grateful. "I know both of you have done a lot for us in this mess," he said. "If it hadn't have been for you, we wouldn't have even had Jackley's story to go on." "We're only sorry it didn't work out as we hoped, Perry," Frank said. "We thought that would clear the whole thing up. Instead, it seems to have involved your father deeper than ever." "It wasn't your fault." "Perhaps something will turn up yet. Joe and I aren't going to lie down on the job now. There isn't much we can do, but we'll have our eyes open for more clues, if there are any." Perry Robinson shrugged his shoulders dispiritedly. "I guess there isn't much use now," he said. "But I appreciate it of you." When he went away, the Hardy boys watched him going down the front walk. His carefree stride was gone, and instead he walked mechanically, as though in a daze. "What a fine pair of detectives we are!" exclaimed Frank in sudden disgust. "If we had been any good at all, we could have got those clues soon enough for Dad to have caught Jackley in time." "No use worrying about that now," replied his brother. "It was just the way things happened." "Well, there's one thing left. We must find that loot." "Haven't we tried?" "Yes, but we can try some more. We've just got to clear Mr. Robinson. And there's only one way. We must find the loot." It was a dull, gloomy day, indicative of rain, and this did not add to the boys' spirits. To ease their feelings, the brothers took a walk, and quite unconsciously, their steps took them in the vicinity of Tower Mansion. "Let's have a squint at the old place from the outside," suggested Joe. "Don't let Adelia see you, or she'll come after you with a broomstick," chuckled Frank. "Gee, but she's a tartar." They walked into the grounds. It was growing darker now, and they easily made their way among the trees and bushes to the vicinity of the rambling mansion. They gazed up at the old tower questioningly. "Some puzzle," was Frank's comment. "Will the case of the tower treasure ever be solved?" "Search me," was his brother's slangy answer. "Perhaps. Oh, Frank, look!" he added suddenly. He was gazing at the upper windows of the old stone tower. He had seen a strange flash of light. Now this flash was followed by another.
"That's queer," muttered Frank. "What can it mean?"
The light disappeared. Then all of a sudden it flashed out again, and downward, in the direction of the lads.
"Must be looking for us," gasped Joe, and started to get behind a bush.
"It's Adelia, and she has a big flashlight," came a moment later from Frank. "What do you know about that?"
"She's looking for the treasure herself," cried Joe. "Ha! And after all she said about our looking being nothing but foolishness."
They saw the woman gaze out of the window for a few seconds. In one hand, she held the flashlight. For a moment she turned the light into her own face, and the boys saw there a look of utter disgust.
"Didn't find it, I'll bet a cookie," chuckled Joe.
"Come on, let's get away before she spots us," returned his brother, and they were soon on their way. As they walked home, Joe and Frank talked the matter over. They smiled when they thought of the eccentric woman up in that dusty old tower, but their minds soon went back to Slim and the troubles of the Robinson family. "We've got to find that loot," declared Frank emphatically. "No matter where that tower treasure is, we've got to find it."
"Got to? But can we?"
"We simply have to, I tell you." This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to the adventures of the Hardy Boys in The Tower Treasure. I'd love to hear from you, so please send an email to me at kluker@marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.